In the last video, we set up our on-auth state changed handler so that we could actually, when we refresh the page, wait for the user to be pulled from persistent storage so that our application knows about it, so that when you come back to our application, you don't have to log in every time. This was great, but it has one problem. If I flip back to our use user hook, and let's just add a console log for on change ran, and refresh the browser here, we see on change ran twice, which is weird. You would expect that this should only be running once, but the problem is that we have brought in our use user hook in our app and in our homepage. So we have two things that are subscribing to on-auth state changed. And actually both of them have a separate copy of the user state. They happen to generally stay in sync because they're both running through all of the effect logic here, and they're notified when the auth state changes. But it would be better to only have a single set of state and a single handler here for on-auth state changed. So this is going to be a little bit advanced, but and our current version is working, and we could continue building and bringing in Firestore into our application. But I do want to at least expose you to this more advanced way of making sure that we only have one copy of our state and our handler in our application. So let's get rid of that console log. And what I want to introduce is a new part, a new hook, and a new part of the React API, which is called context. So I have the hooks API reference pulled up. If you click on use context, it'll take you to this hook, which has a description. I want to fly down to the code to try to explain this. So context is a mechanism that allows you to share something across a part of your application without having to pass it along explicitly. So what you can do is create a context object. So this context object, you can provide it a default value. Here it's being provided the light theme. And then in your application, somewhere in your application, you use your context object and you use the provider that's within it. So this provider allows you to supply a value to components that are children of this, and the provider, you pass in the value that it should have. Then anywhere nested in here as a child of this provider, we can actually call out to the context and we can ask for its current value. So you can see that this provider renders a toolbar, the toolbar renders a themed button, and here's our themed button down here. And we can say use context and grab this context object, and what it will give back to us is its current value. So in this situation, because the value has been passed in as theme.dark, this button will have access to theme.background and theme.foreground from this dark version of the theme. So you could do this without context. You could explicitly pass into toolbar the theme that you want, and that can pass that down into themed button here, and then themed button would have it explicitly as a prop. Context is a mechanism for creating some kind of prop or state that you don't have to explicitly drill down to the themed button. And this version, I don't see it here, they don't actually do anything to toggle between the themes, but if your theme had some kind of mechanism, like some handlers in here, not handlers, some methods in here that toggled the theme, you would be able to have all of those accessible down here in your button. So taking this example, what we want to do is have a context object that has our user state that can be provided to anyone that wants it. So we'll have a provider that puts the current value of the user state in our application tree, and then any component can just ask for the current value. So we don't have to have a new copy of the state and a new copy of the on-auth state changed handler. We just have one value that's provided to our whole application. All right, let's flip back and start implementing this. So what I want to do is up here, import the create context and use context functions from the React API. Then let's go ahead and collapse that so that we don't have all of that code visible. Let's create a user context, and we're going to create the context here and pass in a default value of null. So create a context for our user with a default value of null. And the reason why we're using a default value of null here is so that we can explicitly determine whether the context has been properly initialized in our application tree, which will make a little bit more sense in a bit. So with that user context, let's export that here. And if we flip back to our application, let's bring in from use user, the user context. And in my application, because this is some data that I want to be accessible basically anywhere in my application, I want to make sure that I'm putting a user context provider high in the application tree. So I'm going to make it a direct child of my browser router. So anything that is a child here, which is my header, footer, my switch, my routes, has access to any value that this has. So this is our provider in our tree. Let's actually use it somewhere in our application. So I want to let's head to my home page here. And we will also bring in the user context. And let's use context here. And we will pass in the user context. So this object that we created in use user here, this is a context object that gives us a provider and gives us a way to consume the context. So when we place the provider in our tree, that means that any child component, like our home page, can use that context to grab the current value. So let's print out the context value is so if we flip back to our application and run it here, we can see the context is undefined because we haven't actually supplied any value. If we head back to our application and we say that the value of this provider is, let's just make it a string for testing purposes, and flip back here, we can see that when it re-rendered, the hot reload triggered, testing printed out here. So whatever value we set up with our provider is supplied to anything that tries to read that context. And it can be as deeply nested in the tree as you need. So my home page is technically, let's see, we've got our context, which has a switch as a child, which has a route, which then has our home page as the child of that. So we're passing this provider value down to this, and could be passed even more deeply nested than that if we need to. And whatever the value is here is whatever is going to be supplied deeper. So we could take our user state and just pass it in as a value here. So we use the hook once in our application, and then our provider takes that value and passes it along to anyone in our application. So my context value here should now be that user information. And as soon as it changes, like I sign out, the context value updates. So we could completely refactor this. Instead of using use user here, we could just, this is our user state. This would all work exactly as we've written it, which is fine. That would work. That would be great. We would then only use user, that hook, once in our app, and we wouldn't use it anywhere else. We'd do something like this, use context. I want to show you a way to build on that with a better pattern, and there's actually a good article here that goes through it that I'll make sure that I link, that walks you through step-by-step building this pattern, which is useful if you ever want to do this context pattern elsewhere in your application. If you have some other state that you want to provide, like theme or some other global state that you want to provide to multiple components. Okay, so to refactor this, what I want is in use user here, I want a hook that I can export, that I can use, that does the logic here of grabbing my context value from the user context object. I don't want any of my components to have to think about the fact that this is context. I want them to be able to just do this, use user, and have the functionality work, but it work under the hood via context, so that there is only one user state in my application, one source of truth. So what I'm going to do is I am going to rename my use user here to use user internal. And we're not going to export that. This is going to be a hook that we use internally inside of this file, and not share it elsewhere. And what we will do is create a new use user hook that is being exported, that our application can use, that is powered by context. And so what this can do is user state is equal to use context on our user context, and then it can just return the user state here. So anyone who uses use user, they don't need to know that this is powered by the context. They just get access to the user state via context. And what I want to do is also, in our application, rather than have to put a component in here that is provided a value externally, I want to create a provider in here. Let's call it user provider, that uses our internal hook from this file and keeps the value up to date using that internal hook. So we're basically taking some of the pattern that we were doing here, where we used user and supplied it to the provider. We're just going to wrap that up into a component. So this is going to be a component that takes whatever children it's given and returns them wrapped in the user context provider. So the children are passed along with the provider wrapping around it. And the value that we want to provide here is the result of our use user internal hook. So we can say user state is use user internal and pass that along. So whatever our internal hook is doing, whatever it returns, is passed along to the provider as the value. So just to kind of connect this to the app, that's essentially what we did here. We used the hook that returned all of our information and provided it here. This is just now one component that does that. So let's add this to our export. And we can put this user provider into our tree. So we no longer need to import user context. We can just import user provider. And let's rename this to user provider. And I believe we're going to have a compile error currently. Yes. So we're getting an error that we can't read property is loading of null. So the problem is that our use user, this hook, is only valid to use as a child of our provider here. Because our provider is the thing that gives us the state that we're reading in here. And if we don't have a provider, we end up with this default value of null. So what we want to do instead, if we look back at our app, we can't use this hook here at the app level because it's only valid as a child of user provider. So I'm just going to refactor our app. I'm going to say, let's create a provider wrapped app here, which is going to take our app component and wrap it in the browser router. And let's wrap it in the user provider. And I made a syntax error here. I gotta make sure I close my app component. So this component is responsible for any providers like our browser router, which uses context, and our user provider here. We're wrapping them around our app so that we have access to them in our app, which means that our app no longer needs these, doesn't need the browser router and the user provider. But since it does have header, footer, and some other stuff, we need to make sure that it's wrapped in one element. So I'm going to use a fragment here so that we don't introduce new DOM markup. And now our app component can use the use user hook because the provider is a parent now. And we just need to make sure that we, instead of exporting app, we export the provider wrapped app. So if I save it now and refresh the page here, we should have that error go away, and our app now is getting the user information via context, and our homepage is getting the user information via context. So if we head back to head back to our homepage here, we don't need this anymore. And we don't need this import anymore or this import anymore. This is still using the same exported function. It's just that we've changed what the exported function is here. It's this use context. So if we go back to our initial test case here, we should be able to console log on change. And remember, that was printing out two things when our application loaded before because we had two users, two use users, and now it's only printing out one. So we do now have a single source of truth in our application that's provided via context. That is our, that single source of truth tells us about the user. And that also means that we have a single subscription to on-auth state changed. So moving this into context is somewhat of an optimization thing and somewhat of a future-proofing this, because if we have multiple copies of user state running around in our application, it's possible to end up in a state where one of them has updated before the other has updated, or we wrote our code in a buggy way, so something has gone wrong and they're not in sync anymore across our application. So by doing this kind of optimization to move it so that we only have one source of truth for the user and one subscription to the on-auth state changed, it also makes it easier for us to track down bugs and keep our whole application in sync, because there's only ever one use user internal that has all of this logic in our application, and that is mounted here in our provider. One extra bit that I want to add here that is a little bit of a safety check for us is using this default value. So when we use context and we don't have a provider in the tree, the default value is given to us. So if our application forgot to put in this user provider, I'm just going to comment it out. What we get when we use the context is null. So we can see we're trying to read is loading of null here, and we're getting that error in two places because we're using the hook in two places. That null is coming from create context here. So what we can do is inside of our use user is provide a little bit of a safety net for us. So we can say if the user state is equal to null, which is our default value, then let's throw a new error. And that new error should remind us that use user needs to have a user provider component as a parent in the React tree. So this is an error for us to just like help us enforce that we always have a user provider somewhere in our tree. And we could clean, let's check if the provider is missing by comparing our context value against the default. And this default here is only supplied in the situation when there's no provider in the tree. So that's how we're able to do this selective error throwing. So now if we look back at our application and let's refresh it so that we get the latest error printing out. And we scroll up to the first error, we get our custom error that's telling us use user needs to have a user provider component as a parent in the React tree. So then we would see that and be like, oh, right. We need to fix this, head back to our application, and make sure that there is a user provider before anywhere where we try to use user. And our application works again. And all of this should be still working. I should be able to log in with my Google account, refresh the page, and have that detect and kick me over to the logged in version. And all of this is with a single source of truth in our application using React context. So React context was really useful in this case when we had some global information, some global state, this internal hook that we wanted to share across multiple parts of our application. You can use it for other parts of your application too, like if you want to maintain the game state and you need that across multiple components or a theme or whatever else. The same pattern that we're doing here could be extended to those contexts. I'll give you one word of warning though, React context, this is a great way that's built into React to do some of this simple global state management in an easy way. It is not the most performant way to do this, and it is a way that is tied to the hierarchy of your DOM tree. And there are libraries out there like Redux and MobX and Recoil, which allow you to, in a more performant way, do this separation of your state logic and have your kind of global store available to you. So this is a great way to get started. And then as your application grows, you may want to look at those libraries for managing your user state or your game state or whatever state in a better way. All right, that's it for this video. This wraps up our user state management, and we will then now start diving back into bringing in the database into our application. Now that we have a user, we can actually start storing user data, and we can actually start securing user data. So that'll be coming up next.